to start the recording now.
Terrific.
Great.
That
Thanks.
note appeared in the top corner. Okay, so I was an American Baptist pastor and had various roles at the denominational level over 40 years. When we retired, my wife and I founded a spiritual formation ministry, and I'm about to publish a book called God is Just Love, which relates to all of this. The subtitle is Building Spiritual Resilience and Sustainable Communities for the Sake of Our Children and the Creation. So, who's next?
I'm Michael Dowd, and I have known Ken since the late 1980s when he was pastoring an American Baptist church in Massachusetts, Littleton, and I was pastoring an American Baptist and UCC Federated Church in Western Massachusetts, Granville. And I've now been, for the last 19 years, traveling North America with my wife, who's a science writer, delivering programs in colleges, universities, churches, synagogues, you name it. And essentially where science, inspiration, and sustainability intersect. And climate change for the last 8 years, and the rise and fall of civilizations, and abrupt climate change, and the cascading challenges that we face that have really that morphed into a predicament has been my major focus. I also wrote a book called Thank God for Evolution that did quite well about a dozen years ago or so.
Thanks, Mike.
So I'm David Wheeler, a longtime pastor and/or professor of theology and ethics. I've been interested in issues of global environment my whole life. Currently teaching international students in a program jointly sponsored by Palmer Seminary and the Board of International Ministries.
Well, I'm Owen Owens, and I've been retired from American Baptist National Ministries for 20 years. So I have throughout my life, for many years, I've worked on the ecology justice intersection and how these crises open opportunities as well as close doors to us. And I continue to work with that.
Thanks, Owen.
I'm Betsy Sowers. Yeah, I know Ken from back in the 80s as well, when we were in Acton and you were in Littleton.
Right.
And I was working at Tabcom. Anyway, I came to this earth justice business out of feminist theology, and I came to feminist theology at Old Cambridge Baptist Church back when I was a layperson there in the early 70s. And that led me to Harvard Divinity School, which was a hotbed of feminist and liberation theologies in the 1970s. So that was where I started to understand the connections between ecological theology and feminist theology and other liberation theologies. And those have been complemented over the year with exposure to traditions of contemplation and mysticism. And by a whole bunch of years, those of you who know me well know I worked 15 years for Pan American World Airways, both before and during my early years of ministry, and got to travel all over the world. So I was like, for a Baptist, a full immersion experience in other ecosystems and other religions that have really shaped a lot of my perspective. And then in retirement, I experienced a call to work full-time on theologically grounded earth justice ministry. And I have a volunteer position at Old Cambridge Baptist doing that. And I'm also a board member in a frontline community organizing against an Enbridge compressor station in my town right next to, you guessed it, 2 environmental justice communities. So yeah, it's both theology and action that keep me in this business.
Okay, thanks, Betsy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Bigelow. I'm based in DC.
I work for Bread for the World Institute. My focus as a research analyst and project manager, I lead the climate work at Bread. And my research is mainly focused on climate and food security issues.
Wow.
And I also intersect that as well with racial equity and looking at how communities of color, as well as like women and low income communities, are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate, and that will thus have a consequence of increasing hunger. I went to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Similar to Betsy, I do focus more so on womanist theology, but still in liberation theology and everything as well.
Thanks, Karen.
Well, I'll go. My name is Brian Jackson. I live in Washington State. I am an author and writer. I've published 3 books. I was ordained in 2000 in the American Baptist churches. Have spent a little bit of time as a church associate, parish associate. Been a hospital chaplain, pastoral counselor in private practice, which was probably my favorite aspect of ministry. I am an active Cherokee. I belong to the Mount Hood Cherokees, which is a satellite community of the Cherokee Nation. I also did some postgraduate work at the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family, and that informs a great deal of my writing and my theoretical approaches. So I guess that's about it.
Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
By the way, there are at least 3 people who've sent me notes that they're involved in ministry and family health emergencies today and are not be able to join us. Hoping Catherine Smith will sign in at least part-time. But we have some really good people who weren't able to make it, and we hope they'll get a chance to look at this material and rejoin our conversation.
I'll go next. My name is Don Ng. I am a retired local church pastor here in the San Francisco area after 17 years of service there. Prior to that, I was a staff member at American Baptist Educational Ministries for a good part of my lifetime. When I was serving as president of the denomination, Roy Medley, and continues to be active with the National Council of Churches of Christ, came back from a meeting and was wondering why American Baptists stopped having a desk in the area of eco-justice, which is one of Owen Owens' major portfolios. And so with Ian Marowich and Tom Carr, we started the ABC Creation Justice Network, which is an ongoing group, and a number of people on this conference call are members of that. My particular interest in creation justice is actually rooted from our daughter Lauren Ng's Master of Divinity thesis on animal theology. And so she, as a vegan, and I am still a vegetarian, my advocacy is that when we become plant-based consumers, we would have a direct impact on climate change.
Okay, thanks, Don.
Amen.
Alan, you want to have a word?
Oh, you did that. I was like, we have toilet paper.
Maybe not. Okay.
Alan's
So has
muted.
everyone had a chance to speak who wanted to?
I can go next. I'm Rebecca Driscoll. I'm currently serving as the American Baptist Church's Minister for Creation Justice. I came into this work through food and thinking about food waste and food reduction and repurposing food that would otherwise be thrown out by supermarkets and restaurants and things like that. And also my time serving as a park ranger in the Boston Harbor Islands. And so through the Creation Justice Network that Don mentioned and Owen Owen's work, we were able to propose through the Co-Creator Incubators grant with the American Baptist Home Mission Societies that our denomination, like many other mainline Protestant denominations, should have a national staff person assigned to Creation Justice Ministries. And so with the help of the Creation Justice Network and then also the ABHMS Co-Creator Incubators grant, we were able to propose a position and then create it. And I was called to serve in that role. So I'm very excited to be here, but the role is grant funded. And so the termination of the grant is March 2021. And so right now we're looking at other options of after March, what will this position look like? What will the role of Creation Justice and the Creation Justice Network look like within the denomination and beyond?
Let me quickly say here that one of our goals is to figure out what we all must do together, how we can partner with each other in such a way to pay really careful attention to the fierce urgency of now, which includes making sure that we have staff at a national level. It also includes the latest face that just joined us. Ricardo is one of our missionaries in Guatemala and works with a network of folks in the Caribbean who have come up with some great strategies and long to link up with us. And so one of the things we're hoping is going to happen is that connections will get made through this conversation, and we will have a deeper sense of urgency and we'll get things done that need to get done because we're working together and know about each other. So Ricardo, do you want to introduce yourself? We're just doing very brief introductions.
Blessing my brothers and sisters. Hola.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Hola. Wonderful. I am, Ken just say, we have a continental network for peace that is in 11 countries. And we are focusing on the economy of dispossession that is destroying our planet and killing our defenders, guardians of creation. And we are delighted, our network is delighted to find you in the States as partners of what we are doing. In another time, we can tell you a little bit more of what we are doing, but I'm blessed by finding you and by connecting with you. I am originally from Puerto Rico, but I live in Guatemala. I am with the Ecumenical Council of Guatemala. And from here, we are coordinating the network that is in 11 countries that I just told. Blessings, my brothers and sisters.
Thank you, Ricardo. Kathleen?
Yeah, I already was bending Ken's ear about this, but anyway, I'm an atmospheric scientist and a member of Emmanuel Baptist Church in downtown Albany, although I live in a rural area about 25 miles from there. I've been up to my eyeballs in atmospheric physics for 30 years now. What else? Actually, it's interesting to hear some discussion of feminist theology because I actually sort of came to Christianity through feminism. I was a feminist before I was a Christian. I was baptized at the age of 39. It was a long time ago. But I first had started reading in feminist theology just because I read everything that's in front of me. So, I too see a lot of connections there. I also am interested to hear about Brian's connection with the Cherokee, since one of my college roommates was Robin Kimmerer, who is a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. And we actually, every now and again, we managed to find time to go camping together, as we did when we were youths, which we did at the end of August. And sometimes we used to say about that feminist theologian, Mary Daly, we used to say, like, can you imagine playing Scrabble with Mary Daly? Well, going camping with Robin Kimmerer is like playing Scrabble with Mary Daly.
How about it?
Kathy, I have to tell you that my wife and I long to find a time to sit down with Robin Wall Kimmerer. We've read her book and listened to her online, and phenomenal human being. And we would just love it. Anyway, maybe I'll talk to you about that.
Yeah. Yep.
Anybody else want
It's
to introduce themselves?
very interesting.
Alan tried to, but his mic was turned off.
You hear me now?
Yeah.
We can hear you now. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, it's because I was trying to come through the phone. I guess you muted me somehow so I couldn't get my phone to. So I'm a member of the Creation Justice Network steering team. I'm a retired technical fellow researcher from the DuPont Company after almost 40 years of over 40 years of research. And I've had an interest in environmental issues throughout my life. I'm studying for a climate change certificate at University of Penn. I'm starting my second class today. In fact, I'm doing homework before on this call. And I'm hoping to take the vast gifts that God gave me and make a little impact on sustaining our earth for future generations.
Amen. Amen. Well, a couple of months ago, I began having long Zoom conversations and phone conversations with most of you. And we all decided together that there was a deeper urgency to working together and partnering and making a difference within our ABC family than was currently going on. So we got together the first time. At the end of that meeting, it was really clear to all of us that the urgency was even more fierce, and the predicaments we face are even more urgent, and we needed to dive deeper into the worldview, the big story, the larger picture, the universal crisis, however you want to call it, and understand even more deeply why we're doing what we're doing and how we must respond going into the future, and then how we can connect and do this work together. So we decided to have this second call. There is no schedule at this point for another meeting of any kind. That would have to be decided by us later. But in order to proceed with that agenda, we've invited 3 people to make presentations and possibly do a Q&A on various parts of the overall story, the worldview that are very significant to them, and of which they are pretty good spokespeople for a particular way of looking at the big story, the worldview. And the first one of those is going to be Betsy Sowers, whose church in Massachusetts is, I think, far and away leading our denomination in terms of what churches can do. And through her work with the Baptist, the Alliance of Baptists and others, she's both written material and come across other materials related to the worldview that the Bible puts forth and other interpretations of Scripture. So Betsy, the floor is yours for, I hope, about 20 minutes.
Okay, I'm starting a timer here.
Okay.
It's a tall order to do this in 20 minutes.
Yeah, I know, right.
And because of the time constraints, I'm not going to even try to do a theological deep dive. I did send a couple of my sample sermons out to you yesterday to give you a taste of my attempts, as Mary Daly said, to remember and redeem some of our foundational stories. But for today's purposes, I want to just remind us quickly of two key points about doing theology, and then move to some eco-theology in action for our churches because of the fierce urgency of now. So first, the first theological point that we all know, I think, is that assessing any theological perspective requires also an awareness of how and by whom power is being wielded and legitimized. For the sake of this conversation, I'm going to oversimplify and say Christians in the United States are roughly divided in between theologies of dominance with a disposable earth and disposable populations view, which unfortunately is quite prevalent among white evangelicals at the moment. And I sent a little piece in yesterday's email about that. Or a theology of beloved community that encompasses both humans and the more than human. The consequences of each of these theologies are deeply intersectional and all about where the power is. I like to quote Hop Hopkins from the Sierra Club, who says, "You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism." So that's just one little example of how intersectional all of these things are and how they all start with our theological worldview and where the power is in the theological worldview. So it's our call to reveal the unjust power arrangements that are implicit in these theologies of dominance, because they're often hidden, and to remember and act upon the liberationist roots of our Judeo-Christian story, which gets me to the second theological point. While we can and should be informed by other faiths, indigenous practices, science, and psychology, our own tradition, our own biblical tradition, has a very strong eco-theological thread that needs to be remembered. And it can be transformative for folks in our churches who have a very high view of Scripture, but have been seduced by theologies of Christian empire. So this morning, I mailed you links to 3 PowerPoints of Bible study sessions that eco-theologian Ched Myers presented at the 2018 Alliance of Baptists Gathering. And obviously not to look at before this because they're long and involved and complicated. But I invite you to download those if you have Dropbox. Actually soon, because I think the links are going to expire in a couple days. So if you have problems, shoot me an email and we'll see if we can figure out Dropbox. I'm not an expert with that. But anyway, Ched Myers, if you're not familiar with him, is an eco-theologian who really works with our Scripture. He has done a lot of work with indigenous communities over the year. And in those 3 Bible studies at the Alliance Gathering, he laid out examples of the indigenous, after all, our ancient ancestors were indigenous people in the Middle East, the indigenous earth-based, earth-connected faith of our ancestors, all the way from Genesis to Revelation. And he just blew us away. He recovers the role of our more than human kin as actors in the biblical stories of liberation, not just part of the scenery for the human drama. And looking at Scripture that way is really transformative. Even as someone who's been doing this work for a long time, he just transformed the way I look at Scripture. And I would say, for example, I was just looking at the Advent text the other day, and all the Isaiah Advent texts and the Psalms this year. If you look at them, flip it and look at them from the perspective of the natural world in those texts, and it just makes this huge difference. So I cannot commend those Bible studies more highly. They are the most profound Bible studies I've ever been a part of, and everyone else, we were all just sitting there in the Alliance with our mouths hanging open. It was just brilliant. So those are the two theological points I want to make, but because my time is limited, and because we are living in a moment of imminent ecological and civilizational collapse, I want to spend the time I have left with you on how we engage willing congregations for action. Yes, we do want to evangelize our co-religionists into the theology of beloved community and away from those theologies of disposable earth. But we already have that small group of committed people that Margaret Mead famously said is the only thing that has ever changed the world. And the fierce urgency of now calls us to action. I don't want to say we don't want to work on the people who aren't convinced, but that's right now, that's not really job one. Right now, we have to make systemic change with the people we've got, and and bring along the other folks as we can, because the urgency is so deep. So I want to take you on a quick tour of the Alliance of Baptist Creation Justice Statement, Earth Beloved Community, which I drafted for their creation justice community at their request for that 2018 gathering. And if you haven't already gotten it in front of you, it came in that email yesterday from Betsy Sowers. So if I'd like you to have it in front of you if you can. The goal of that, the way it is set up, is to mainstream an eco-theology and eco-justice into the life and ministry of the congregations, so that it isn't just put in a silo with a green team or a creation care committee, but really becomes part of the life and ministry and commitment to justice in the congregation. So it was adopted by a policy of the Alliance in 2018, and the creation justice community there has been really trying to work to get individual congregations to adopt it. And OCBC, where Old Cambridge, where I serve, I serve there as the point person to the various committees and teams in implementing it. So I'd like to invite us all, as now that's sitting in the American Baptist context, to think how something similar might be useful to ABC congregations as we go through the statement. Folks, show of hands, you all have it where you can see it. I see some head shakes because I don't want to have to, given the time, I don't want to have to read the whole thing. It starts with a theological affirmation, and God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good, and then goes on to name the problem. And that is just a very small piece of the laundry list of the disasters that are unfolding. If I were to write that list now, I would have to add COVID. And I think I would stress environmental racism a little more specifically than I did in the list, because that's where the main place I'm working right now. And but by and large, it's just, to get people's attention who maybe aren't quite as aware of the disaster that's unfolding. And then the second piece is the response. And the response is fourfold: a theology, practice, and proclamation of earth justice. And the reason it's fourfold is, as I said, to get it into every aspect of the church's life and ministry. And of course, it starts with theology. So there's a brief statement of the theology of beloved community, and the idolatry of like the worship of markets and the disposable earth theology. And at OCBC, we have a spiritual life team that is responsible for working with the pastor around worship and the general spiritual life. I work with the children and adult ed teams around curricular kind of things to teach this theology. I just put a little asterisk and said, don't forget to mention Harvey Cox, who wrote a great little book called The Market as God a couple of years ago, which yeah, which really spells out the religion of the markets and some alternatives. And he actually gave a copy to the Pope when he visited the Pope, and the Pope gave him a copy of his encyclical. So that was nice to have that connection. So yeah, so it starts with theology and the preaching, and now I would say almost every sermon at Old Cambridge Baptist Church has some kind of eco-justice. Not everyone is all about eco-justice, but it's in there. It gets a mention every time, especially as we're mentioning other justice issues that we care about, whether it's racial justice or immigration justice and um, the value of life, so on. So there has really been a shift that it's not just on Earth Sunday, and it's not in a silo. It's really a part of how people understand their theology and the mission of the church. Second, the pastoral care aspect. We will respond pastorally to the fear and grief of climate catastrophe. And boy, I could do a whole session just on the role of the denial of death in the climate crisis, and
Yes.
and how, as people whose business it is in church to be helping people put their own deaths and death on a larger scale into a context of faith and trust and a pastoral task, that is really critical, because people aren't going to be able to even think about. I mean, people are in such denial about the death of the whole ecosystem because they can't even cope with their own death and the death of the people they love. And now that we're in COVID, I think it is just it's really on the front burner right now, and it's a role for churches to be addressing this theologically. So we have a congregational care team, which in many churches is the pastoral care team, but we're Baptist, so it's the congregational care team. So I work with them and the pastors and again, the adult CE folks to do both pastoral care and programming around that. And Cody Sanders, our pastor, has done a lot of work on green burial and home funerals and the whole theology of those, which could be, he could do another whole thing on that. That's getting us to think about our bodies and what is the relationship of our bodies to the earth once they are no longer living. And do we really want to pump them full of poisons and put them in a box that never goes back to nature? And, all of those kinds of theological issues. So that's a piece of that. Number 3 is engaging in corporate and spiritual disciplines and the consumption of resources. And often my experience is that that's what people in churches think this is all about. It's just, oh, let's eat less meat, let's drive a Prius, let's reuse, recycle, blah, 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 and all of that, I don't want to belittle that. All of that is important, but that's only, it's necessary, but not sufficient. If we all did all of that stuff as individuals, I can't remember what the stats were. I saw something about it might make a 5% change or something on climate change, but the real causes of climate change are not coming about from individual choices. And in fact, that is something that corporations are very intentional about promoting. The whole carbon footprint, being obsessed with our carbon footprints came from BP. The Native American crying about the litter, that I forget which, it came from one of the big corporations as well. It's all about saying, oh, you should feel guilty. It's all your fault. If you just made better choices, if you didn't demand our products, everything would be fine. And meanwhile, they're spending gazillions of dollars on lobbying and misinformation and making sure that we have no choice other than their products. Because they're getting subsidies for fossil fuels and plastics and all of those other things. So, how are you going to choose not to get your strawberries in a plastic container? So necessary but not sufficient, which moves me to the last and most important one, which is why I'm talking so quickly, because I don't want to miss the last one, which is public policy and legislation, frontline work. The thing at the Alliance of Baptists where Ched Myers did the Bible studies, he also did a workshop that I went to, and there must have been maybe 30 people in it. And he had us go around and introduce ourselves by what watershed we live in. And it was surprising how many people had to pick up their phones and look because they didn't know which watershed they were in, to stress the hyper locality of some of the action that needs to be done. And then had everybody go around and say what environmental issue was critical in their watershed. And every single person could name a frontline issue in their watershed. So we are all in frontline communities. And if we're not, we're next door to one. So we don't, it's nice to, it's important to write to Washington and all of that, but you can be the most effective right where you are. And I've discovered that in my own community, and then working on state level political regulatory policy, legislative policy. And I got to say, it's a steep learning curve, to learn all the acronyms and who does what. But at the state level, particularly if you live near the capital, as I do in Massachusetts, all it really takes is one visit to your state legislators, and they know you by name. And I know my state senator, my state rep, I know them on a first name basis. I know all of their staff, and it didn't take a lot of effort. And someone said, if they get at the state level, if they get 10 letters, it's a mandate, because not everybody advocates at the state level the way they do at the federal. So all that's saying, it's organize. We need to organize locally in our towns. In fact, I'm missing a meeting right now with the mayor, with some of my board members, but it's not that hard to develop the relationships in your city or town and with your state folks, and then to build coalitions, not just you and your congregation. Here in Massachusetts, we have a coalition of over 250 groups that's called Mass Power Forward, and it's all of both faith-based and like the 350s and all of the environmental groups, and along with some pro-environmental business groups, so that we have annual lobby days where we just get hundreds and hundreds of people to the State House for whatever legislation is pending that has to do with environmental justice and climate change. And that's a really important piece of our witness. So those are the pieces of that. And I see them probably got a minute and a half for discussion. I wanted to have more time for discussion to see how that sits with some of you, and whether you think that something similar might work in our congregations, doing that kind of a holistic push to get our congregations engaged. So I'll stop and ask for comments or questions.
Betsy, we could take comments and questions now, or we can just take advantage of the time at the end to do that.
That's fine.
We definitely are going to run out of time, or maybe people will keep together for longer than I expect, but I hope we don't need to do that. The only comment I want to make about what Betsy just shared, besides that it's awesome, is that she and Michael and myself have all sent you quite a bit of material, but I have read every word Betsy sent out and watched Ched Myers' videos, and they have just lifted me, energized me, and educated me. And that material, we just have to keep working at learning and growing our understanding of what's going on. And there's no way to do it except by putting the effort into it. Michael's about to talk. I've watched 50 of his podcasts, if I've watched one. I have read his book. I've listened to him personally, and I keep learning and growing, and we really have to work at this. And a lot of us are limited in the amount of time we have to work, which is why we choose a focus. and we learn in a particular region. Like my multi-ethnic church has pushed us over the last 3 months to read and participate and study around anti-racism, and that's been a major part of my agenda recently. You have to pick out an area where you really feel the Spirit is leading you to grow and know. And with that, Michael.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks, Betsy. I think I want to keep my remarks kind of simple. I have been involved in eco-theology for decades, and then, did evolutionary evangelism, I guess you could say, for about 12 years. But the last 8 years, I've really become a collapsologist. I've been studying the rise and fall of civilizations, studying why unsustainable, understanding the radical differences, the foundational differences between genuinely sustainable, pro-future cultures and what gets called sustainable or sustainability, which is really faux sustainability. It's delusional. And what are the fundamental differences between them? And it's sobering, to say the least, especially when you realize that, kind of that old 12-step prayer: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Because I went through the classic, and most of us who get into this world of not just climate change, but abrupt climate change, where you're looking at 10,000 years of climate change in a half a human lifetime. When you start understanding things like that and understanding these self-reinforcing feedbacks, you realize that there's a whole lot, and especially when you really understand collapse. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that we have dozens, scores actually, of examples of previous civilizations that went through boom and bust. The first 98% of human history, we lived more or less sustainably. We lived in a way that was an I-thou relationship to the living world, and treated the living world as divine in one form or another, whatever mythic names we gave to that reality. And preserved the well-being of the soil, the forest, the water, the life upon which we depended for our children and grandchildren. That was our sacred responsibility. With agriculture, and especially the mining of metals and the creation of weapons of aggression, you run into this sort of parable of the tribes kind of thing, where it becomes almost an evolutionary arms race. And you end up where we are now, which is a global industrial civilization bent that's a self-organizing system that's way beyond the control of any small group or one individual or cabal or whatever. So the hugest piece of my ministry now, I've just completed, Connie and I just spent the last 19 years, almost 19 years, traveling North America. We've spoken to about 3,000 groups across the continent, radically diverse, religious of all kinds, non-religious, anti-religious, environmentalists. My main work now is helping people understand what's real, what's undeniably the case, and what's still possible, and what's really futile, what's not possible anymore. And that we, to discern that, and then to deal with the grief of expectations. I mean, everybody, on this call, and most of us in our congregants and had certain expectations growing up that we're now realizing are not going to be fulfilled. And so I find that my message is both, most people have a clarity, oh my God, of course, of course, of course. There's this understanding which takes away the confusion, and takes away a lot of the blame game that it's so normal that we go into. But then in the wake of that is often sadness, deep and profound sadness, that our children are not going to have it better and easier than us, that our grandchildren, if they're graced to exist at all, if the planet even supports human life in 50 years from now, most of those things are out of our control at this point, which doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. There's lots we can do, but what we can do usually can make a difference at local scale. And industrial civilization, capitalism, is going to experience the consequences of its own actions, and that's now unstoppable. So how do you help people deal with that? How do we as congregational leaders prepare our congregations to do the heart work of grief and sadness and all that, so that we can be a blessing when our friends, neighbors, relatives, and coworkers, family members are in freak out mode, when they realize, as we all will at some point, most of us will realize that 2020 is probably going to be the easiest, best year of our lives. It's going to continue to get worse. And that's a painful pill to swallow. Most people, frankly, can't swallow that. They will deny that, understandably. And so how to have compassion with our friends and loved ones who are in one or another form of denial, which really can be a form of adaptive inattention. I mean, there's a whole lot of people who aren't in denial of climate change. They fully accept the science of climate change, but they know there's not a damn thing that we're going to do about it as a species, no matter how much activism and passion and interest and whatever that individuals can have. And so they don't want to think about it on a day-by-day basis. I mean, after almost 19 years of traveling North America, my wife and I now have settled into Ypsilanti, Michigan, 2 blocks from my 5-month-old granddaughter. And I go over and spend an hour and a half to 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, just caring for my granddaughter. And so how to have a great life, how to have healthy relationships, how to have joy, how to have a sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment, even in the face of accepting that our species may, I mean, what's inevitable is the extinction of Homo colossus, this wasteful industrial way of being human. That may or may not include the extinction of Homo sapiens, only time will tell. But how do we prepare our hearts and our congregations and our ministries so that our people can at least be a step or two ahead? Because I think we're in the early stages of the greatest mental health crisis in human history, especially when people realize that there's no going back to normal. Normal is what got us here. And COVID-19 vaccine or not, it doesn't matter. There is no going back to normal. So how do we be with that? And how do we wake up each day inspired, even in the midst of collapse of industrial civilization that's already been in place for almost 35 years. It's not will civilization collapse. Every unsustainable civilization collapses. It goes through a very predictable sequence. We are clearly in that sequence, and we're good 30 to 35 years into it. So it's not a matter of will it happen. It's been happening. We just don't have the eyes to see it, most of us. So that's why much of my work has been about post-doom and post-gloom. It's like how to help people understand what's happening and why, move through the painful, difficult emotions, especially when we accept, that things could be really, really bad, and then come through that, go through the, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and then what Paul Schifferker calls finding the gift on the other side of acceptance, and then living our lives from that point as a blessing, so that we be hope for others, that we're not clinging on to what can give us hope, that we are hope in who we be in that. So that's the hugest piece to my own work. And the videos that I've created, the post-doom collapse and adaptation primer videos, are the best tool that I've created and that I know of that helps people make this transition, and then ultimately to come through to a place of, oh, wow, a deep understanding, clarity with regards to their own role that they can play within the body of life, to be Christian, to be Christ-like, to be a blessing, a sacrificial, incarnational blessing to our communities and to the future, even if our species goes extinct in the near term, which is absolutely possible. So on that cheery note, I'll pass it over to you, Ken.
I'm primed for that exact moment. I live the grief and the sadness some days. I live it in relationship to the animals around our house and my wife, who particularly is a lover of animals, and I live it in relationship to my 12 grandchildren. And yet most days I live with an enormous amount of joy, and I have a really happy life, even though I know that my world, my family, everything that I care for is facing some pretty severe predicaments. And I had a plan for my presentation when I woke up this morning. but something happened between then, and I want to read you the devotional word for this morning that I read on my front porch, watching the deer walk by and the cats, the feral cats coming, hoping that my wife would give them some food, which she would. And this is the devotional reading that got me lifted up and feeling the joy of life. Here it goes. Linger in my presence a while. This author speaks as if she's the voice of God, Sarah Young. Rein in your impulses to plunge into the day's activities. I face that temptation every single day. Rein in your impulses to plunge into the day's activities. Begin your day alone with me, and that is the essential preparation for success. A great athlete takes time to prepare herself mentally and spiritually for the feat ahead and before he even moves a muscle. Similarly, your time being still in my presence equips you for the day ahead of you. If you are not adequately equipped for the journey, you will grow weary and lose heart. Relax with me while I ready you for action. The two main themes of the book I am about to publish are about building spiritual resilience and sustainable communities. And these are communities within which spirit is nurtured so that we find the hope and can be the love that is required of us in order to be the people God needs us to be at this time. Earlier this week, I went out to Columbus, where my grandchildren live. My primary purpose of that trip was that my daughter had kids that were throwing up, and 5 of them. She does foster care, and the whole household was sick with some kind of bug. And so I wasn't going to actually go in and have dinner with them. Instead, I stopped at Costco and bought pizza, and I just dropped it off and handed it to them. And during the trip up and back, I literally listened 3 times to one of the podcasts that Michael does that I had not heard before, only 30 minutes long. I will send it to you after this meeting if anyone is interested. It's with Carolyn Baker. And if I was a technological whiz, I would edit her presentation into about 5 minutes and play it for you, but I'm just going to read the parts that touch me the most. Carolyn Baker, according to Michael and everybody else that I know, and I've read her material myself, is probably a premier teacher of how to live well in difficult times. And she says, my work is to hold something so close to my heart, like it is never, ever going to go away. And then when it is time to let it go, to let it go. My most important work is to hold 2 things in tension. And then she uses the metaphor, which is the title of her of this podcast, WASF. Some of you know what most people refer to when they use those initials, WASF, but she calls it, we are so fortunate. We are so fortunate to be alive at this time in human history. We are so blessed to be able to be people who can teach our children and our grandchildren and send into the future a message of hope and love. She says that she began to wake up to the trouble we're all in the year 2000, and then she watched a movie in 2007 called What a Way to Go, Life at the End of Empire. What a way to go, life at the end of empire. And I have to turn I actually have a phone ringing here. It's Okay. She tells Michael in this interview, I speak of climate catastrophe and climate trauma. And then she says, those two words really are all about the same thing. There is trauma, and the people who are gifted and skilled in helping people find hope and be loved in the midst of difficulty are the people going to be most in demand in our world today. People of faith, people of hope, people who can be loved no matter what's going on around them. Most recently, she says, and this was the best part of the conversation. Most recently, I began talking about planetary rite of passage. Planetary rite of passage. When I frame our predicament that way, it gives me an entirely different perspective. It is no longer about humanity as the villain or me as a victim. It is rather that humanity has created for itself a tragic ordeal that we have to pass through as a rite of passage in order to return to the wisdom that we rejected. I'm going to get into that wisdom that we rejected because it's another part of my reading and study right now that I seem to find more and more about everywhere I turn. She believes we rejected the wisdom of how to live well on the planet Earth, that we used to know how to do it and we don't know anymore. And this planetary rite of passage is that we're going to learn again. And should human beings be given another opportunity to live well on the planet, and should indigenous cultures have influence and continue to live on the planet, we will learn once again how to live well on the earth. And then she says, of course, rites of passage are never fair. In other words, the poor and the minorities always suffer first and most. Planetary rite of passage will not be fair, rational, or predictable. It was understood by indigenous people who did rites of passage with their young people that it was always a brush with death, and that some of their young people would not survive the initiations. But it was important, so important to the community, that their young people learn that life and death are part of the same process and not to be feared or avoided. What are people going to do emotionally and spiritually, Carolyn Baker asked. And now she's thinking as a therapist, which is her professional training. So they not only just cope with the cataclysms that are around the next corner, including COVID-19 right now, but turn them into a rite of passage in order to learn how to live well on the planet. Life is not about perpetual progress. Life is not about everything being brighter day by day. Life is a wide range of experience that involves suffering. We have to be prepared to be kicked in the butt by the darkness and by our own shadows. If we don't make a descent into the shadow, we can never learn to live deeply. So now she's beginning at this point in her life to really understand the trauma of our lives as a rite of passage, and doesn't want people just to survive it. She wants people to come through it with a transformed consciousness. On some level, she says, everyone knows that we are already living in climate catastrophe. We are surrounded by mass anxiety and increased suicides, and the tension that results in the kind of fear that results in the kind of political chaos we're living through. It is not accidental that Donald Trump is doing his thing in the world. It's happening around about because people are so frightened. But she says people also have a deep inner wisdom. Our natural state is that we have an inherent wisdom called by many indigenous wisdom, but then we lost it in humanity. This is a crazy line she has. We went on a savage rampage to become God. We rejected the wisdom, and the consequences are upon us. And there is something that we need to do differently right now, every one of us and every person needs to find their part of that work to help humanity recover its wisdom. As my awareness of the destruction of the planet deepens, so does my grief. And when I allow grief to be the doorway into more grief, you may not believe this, but it is my experience of life these days. The paradox is that on the other side of all that grief, I wake up to an uncanny joy and meaning and purpose and a greater quality of love than I could have ever imagined before. So to die wisely is to die in wonder and awe and reverence and gratitude and beauty. To die well is to die grief-soaked and gratitude-soaked as well. And at the same time, to die very busy doing everything we can and everything we can teach others to do to live rightly, which includes all kinds of things that we can do ourselves and that we can teach others to do. I'm going to skip about a few paragraphs of what I was thinking of saying. And one of the things I've been learning recently is a whole different understanding of what it means to be wealthy. And what it means to be wealthy in our culture is all bad news. And it's all lie and it's all destruction. But in indigenous cultures, which were the way humans lived on the planet for 2 million years without destroying anything around them, wealth is a sacred relationship with everything. We belong to the land, not the land to us. We are wealthy beyond imagination. We belong to the creation. The earth takes care of us, and we take care of the earth. Number two, in this living rightly on the earth, there is cradle to grave security for everyone. Everyone in the community is equally secure and shares equally any perils. If anyone goes hungry, they all go hungry together. If anyone prospers, they all prosper together. This is the way it has always been, and it still is in some indigenous cultures. We all live among our neighbors without fear. Number three, the well-being of one is the well-being of all. In coping with a crisis, you are never alone. Number four, we are in this together and we always stand by one another. Number five, a way of life like this has been working for hundreds of thousands of years. Those communities could be conquered, but they could never collapse from within because of corruption or greed or careless destruction of the habitat. And then in my community group tonight at 8 o'clock, we're working on learning what it means to live in community as Jesus calls his people to live. We're comparing those five to the teaching of the early church in the book of Acts. What does wealth from this point of view have in common with the life of the Christian community in the book of Acts? If that question interests you, go back to Acts, read it, and see how it compares. It is possible for us to begin right now living this way rightly with the creation. And to the extent we do, and to the extent that we're teaching our children and grandchildren to live this way, we will wake up in the morning with joy and hope and love for the day ahead. Finally, my last part of this will be simply to, I already emailed you all a part of chapter 14 of my book, where I talk about specifically how my wife and I are living out our lives right now so that we can move in the general direction of redefining wealth for ourselves in the ways that I have just shared that come from indigenous cultures. When I sent my book to the publisher last February, we had already begun doing many of these things. We have one very fuel efficient car. We swore off any international travel as tourists by air. We grow as much food as we can. We buy from local farmers. We replace electric appliances with hand ones. We are now baking bread and composting, and we have our own war on plastics. And we do all kinds of things with our children and our grandchildren to teach these same values. But we also know that our children might be living in a very different world. So we now call the way we're trying to live, living well in two worlds at the same time. And in the second world, we are learning to cook on a campfire, including baking bread, which is not that hard. We make topsoil, we do organic gardening. Kathy has 2 looms, one to weave cloth and one to weave rugs. We use only hand tools to cut firewood. We have a 99% efficient wood stove and are putting in another one. We grow potatoes in garbage cans. We're learning to do woodworking with hand tools. We can food and are going to build a root cellar if we can get enough money together. We give thought to preparedness. We lead online conversations. We seek to build Christian community, on and on and on. There are ways to live well right now that prepare us and the people we love to handle whatever comes next in the world. And when you are living with hope and love, you can wake up no matter what's going on in the world and be the person that Christ needs you to be. So one of the goals that that I hope will come out of this this conversation is that we will find ways to network. And Catherine Smith, and I'm not sure I know how to describe her role, but she's on the Creation Justice Task Force, and she works with other Baptist groups around the country, and she feels a lot of this need to give and to find support for the journey. So she and I are going to create an online community. And we already have a community because there's 2 of us, and anyone else, we're hoping people will join us or recommend, simply to build a community of people who are in the trenches doing this work and need to back each other up. Many of our American Baptist colleagues and pastors are in the trenches all over the country doing this work, but feeling alone in it. Their churches may not support them. They may not be near colleagues. And we want to build, Catherine and I want to build an online community to support each other in the midst of whatever is coming next in our lives and our world. So
that's great.
That's what I needed to say. And so the floor is open, and we actually have at least 15 minutes for comments, questions, points of view, plugging in, making connections, deciding what we do next.
Yeah, so Ken, what you're saying about creating that online community with Kathy, who's the executive director of the Baptist Creation Care Collaborative.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, is our Creation Justice Congregations program that the Creation Justice Network launched in 2019, and inviting congregations and pastors within the ABC to come together. Some of them are already doing Creation Justice ministries and embracing that work, but they don't know that other pastors in other regions are doing the same work. Yeah. So yeah, we're using that Creation Justice Congregations platform and program as a way to make those connections and to create that community. Terrific. And you know, congregations that are already working on things, congregations that are just starting to think about what introducing Creation Justice ministries might look like in their setting. So it runs the sphere of all different things. And right now I'm doing a Creation Justice Congregations Conversations, where I had a conversation with Kathy Moore. I've had one with Kay Rolfs Masalia at Royersford Baptist Church in Pennsylvania, which is our first official Creation Justice congregation. And I'll be scheduling more. And so those conversations are recorded, and it's just, and they'll be posted on our websites, and they're just conversations about what are the Creation Justice ministries that these congregations are embracing, and what does it mean? How are they doing it? Where are they finding hope? Who are they connecting with? Those kinds of things. So what you said, and then also what Betsy was saying earlier, was reminding me of that and the policy statements that the ABC already has around environmental, and a lot of that Owen Owens established and created and supported so that we could have AVC policy statements like that that were passed by the Board of General Ministries.
Rebecca, could you and I have another conversation soon about how we connect all these things?
Sure, that would be great.
Okay, I'll get back to you.
Ken, I'd like to make a brief comment going all the way back, Bessie, to what you brought us. It's imperative, as we all know, to begin thinking strategically and practically. But as a theologian, I'm still thinking about how we rewire our whole approach to our Christian faith.
Yes.
And I heard Bessie talking about that. My first ethics professor talked about what he called a theocentric worldview, not anthropocentric, but not biocentric or ecocentric either, but a theocentric worldview. I'm referring to James Gustafson, who was at Yale and later at the University of Chicago. And if all of our reading of scripture, if all of our teaching, if all of our preaching, if all of our planning is not from the perspective of what we do for human well-being, not that that's bad, but that's not the perspective, nor is it what do we do for ecological flourishing, but rather how do we honor God and further God's purposes. And it involves the question, or rather the assertion, that if we love God, we will love whatever and whomever God loves. And my writing, and to a certain extent my teaching, has centered on trying to do a reading of our scriptural and theological heritage from that point of view. So it's not having a green committee or a green Sunday or even a green sermon series. It's about taking this God's eye, God's heart view of every issue. And that will necessarily include all of the elements of God's creation and all of the elements and entities and individuals that are envisioned in the biblical images of God's reign. So again, I've got some writing that already follows that track, and Ken, you've seen a little bit of it. I'll try to make more of it available.
Thanks, Stephen. Floor is open.
I think we have a door open there because I don't know how many churches are already on the boat with the kingdom of God being upside down from the kingdoms of the world. And so that's an entree into some of the more earth-based theologies, because I know, I was reading Michael's work, which is similar to a lot of what I do. I was thinking back to my systematics class at Harvard Divinity School, where there were no women on the faculty when I started there, at least on tenure track, and there was still this whole theology of the pre-monotheistic religions, the nature worship and the goddess worship, and they were also primitive, and this sort of patriarchal monotheism was this huge advance. And of course, all of us women who were reading Mary Daly, there were really a lot of theological wars going on. But it seems like now that more people have at least been exposed to through some of the work of the Living the Question series of Bible study and all of that, to at least a critique of empire, and that that you can say basically the foundational story in the Hebrew scripture is that God is God and Pharaoh is not, and the foundational story in the New Testament is that God is God and Caesar is not. And you're still being, you can still have a kind of human superiority and all of that over nature, but it's the first step in saying, okay, these theologies, these top-down theologies that justify empire and imperialists and colonialism and racism and sexism and homophobia and the exploitation of nature as an object, those all flow out of that original, confusion of the kingdom of God with a human kingdom. And so, I mean, it seems to me that that's a door where people can, people who have maybe some more conservative theologies can walk through that door when they can't walk through the door of panentheism right away.
Thanks, Betsy.
Yeah, this is Alan. I have a thought. I'm just getting, as we talked the other day, Ken, I'm a layperson in the church. I listened to Michael Dowd's, one of his talks, and I kind of step back and I say, these are all good messages. These are all powerful things. I've read every book that you can imagine about American Indians growing up a kid, and I have modeled a lot of what I do based on how they live. This has been part of my life. And it's always been in conflict with what I hear in the pulpit. And, I left the church for a long time because the church wasn't feeding me. I came back to the church later in my life, and I've constantly had to reconcile where it fails to feed me. And I think we get all lost in this, the theology and everything is good. But I work with youth, I work with young kids, I work with people who are not going to understand these messages in the way you have intellectualized them. We have to figure out how to speak in a way that we transform how people view their position in the world. And it can come from a Christian relationship with a deity or a God, or however you want to package it. And I think I agree with you, Betsy. We confuse the issue. We have half the church wanting to dominate the earth. We got another half of the church wanting to sustain the earth. And they're coming out of the same basic foundational teachings, which we call our Bible. And we've been able to take that, and then through this confusion we created, we have juxtaposed totally different approaches to the world that are both claiming to be followers of Christ. So somehow we have to take this and bring it down. And I always tell my wife, you have to figure out how to speak at the 6th grade level. Because I do science, and I did science education in the school system for 10 years as a volunteer. And when I go to a 1st grade class, I talk differently than when I go to a 4th grade class, and I talk differently when I teach in college as a PhD professor. And the vast majority of the people that we have to impact are reading at a 6th grade level. This is the reality. And until we can take this powerful thinking, and I think it is powerful, so I'm not arguing about the thinking, I think it's very powerful. But until we can transform it to 6th grade communication, and watch our present president and what he does, pound it, simple, stupid statements, but people are following them. So we can intellectualize it and you'll lose your audience. We have to figure out how to take this intellectual knowledge, which is foundational to how we speak, and we have to learn how to speak at a 6th grade. So Michael Dowd, I enjoyed your talk, but I could never take that to you.
And Alan, I welcome.
I mean, and that is, I think, Ken, I think that's some of what you're trying to do, but I think that is critical.
Alan, I welcome the possibility of working with you to help take some of these ideas and have them at the 6th grade reading level. So I would welcome that.
I want to talk to all you guys. Don't get me wrong. I think where you're coming from is powerful. Don't get me wrong.
You all
But-
have each other's email addresses, so anybody who wants to connect, I assume it's fine to use it that way.
Yeah, well, I'm planning to follow up with you, Betsy, and set up a time to talk to you too, because I really want to know what your church is
Ardo, are
doing,
you
much
looking?
deeper than I learned in your 20-minute presentation. But I'll contact you after I have time to read what you already sent me, right?
Alan, I
But
want
the
to,
go ahead.
wanna-
But that's my point. We have to. I mean, we're working on it in our church right now, communicating, and one of the things that God keeps calling me is, just like I learned to take complicated science topics and teach it at various grade levels when I was working K-12 science support. I worked for 10 years supporting math and science education in my state, working with the governor, lieutenant governor, just like Betsy was saying, trying to improve how we teach science. I'm so frustrated on what we've done to education in our country. Right? We teach people not how to think. We teach them a bunch of stuff. We give them information, but we don't teach them what to do with it. We don't know how to solve a problem. And I work as a PhD scientist and bringing in young people. We are hiring people out of college that don't know how to think. 4 years of college. I don't know what they're doing to the education system. Anyway, I've said my piece. I think that this is, to me, what God's been calling me, and I shared it with my creation care team in our last meeting. God is calling me. The last class I took at the university was communication class. How do you speak about things? How do you empathize with people? How do you package information? It's so important to take time to package the message in a way that it can be received. Jesus talked about this all the time.
Thanks, Al.
In addition to, sorry, I just want to add, because for me, I also feel like we have to figure out how to make it not just sixth grade, but also tangible. And as someone, as a Black woman, this year has been absolutely exhausting. And I think for me, and the challenge that I have is, how do we make it, especially for churches of color, who have so many immediate things around just life or death, literally right now. Like, how so that we say this is just as much of an emergency, or to make it something that people care about. Like, for me, I'm worried about, like, oh, if I jaywalk, will I get stopped in the street by a cop? Like, those are things, and it's hard to then talk about things that, even though they are happening, they do still feel relatively far away.
Yeah.
Or how do we then make it practical that, and it's not just for Black churches, there's still children in cages. And when we talk about, like, our Latinx, or there's just so many communities that it's just so hard of, like, how do you prioritize, which fire do you put out? And I think part of it is that for many of my experience in seminaries, that for many of the people of color, what we found to be often hard was when things were so theology heavy and it wasn't necessarily tangible. And for many of us in the communities that we're in, we start from a lived experience and then it goes up to the theology aspect. And so how do we, to Alan's point, like, it's so, rich in, the academia and everything, but how do we make it from a lived experience standpoint? Because that's what people are going to hear. People understand that there's a higher rates of asthma around Black children, in urban areas, and climate change actually makes it worse. And so how do we talk from that perspective? And that's something that I think we have to figure out, because we are a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic denomination. And so how are we making sure that we're speaking to all churches in a way that all can hear? And that may mean that we're saying the same things, but we're just saying it in different ways.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, Karen, I often say, how do we take it to the woman at the well? Jesus knows the theology of God, knows it better than any of us will ever. And he took it to the person at the well. He took it to the leopard. He took it to these people, but he took it to them meeting them where they were. And I think that's what you're saying. And I believe that's where we as a church sometimes fall.
I think Ricardo's trying to get into this conversation with the word. Is that correct, Ricardo?
Yeah, I want to say a word before we leave. Uh, Thank you for bringing us together, Ken. And thank you for sharing. I think that the way you are living good and it helps for people who are stuck with the pandemic to imagine way of thinking and to inspire them. But I think that we need to get close, uh, the people, we Christians, to the pain and the suffering of creation and her brothers, the humans, and we should do something for them, for her. But we should uh, um, challenge the technocratic industrial model. And I, as uh, Michael said, it can be overwhelming to challenge what this system is about. But the way I think in the way we do it is working with the communities that are organized, resisting the mining companies, the water dams in Latin America, and with the clear consciousness of what implies for them the destruction of creation. And then instead of we coming to them as the redeemers, that we come as a partner, working with them as a brother, and 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 in that way, and celebrating maybe the little things that we are being able to accomplish, and taking care of one another in this struggle where all the evil powers are organized, not for defending creation, not for defending the people that are defending creation, but for defending the power for big business that is about profit. So, and I think that we should be moving out a little bit beyond of the emission of carbon as the climate problem of our planet, because there is a lot of experimentation and research of the militaries of how can you change the climate, and with electromagnetic wave or chemical substance in the atmosphere, and that are really destroying the planet. So there are topics that are very profound, and we should be looking at them as well. And 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 uh, and the way we're doing this in Latin America, we with our network, is taking care of the guardians of creation, and we call guardians of creation the organized communities that are located defending their territory. And with them, we are partners. We are developing partnerships. And coming together, we are doing we face an action, Be Guardians of Creation campaign. And the reason why I was so delighted to find you is because I think, I'm not here, but I think that you can be partners in the United States. We need also partners in Canada, because many of the suffering that our creation is having in our countries are coming from powerful companies that have the headquarters in the United States or Canada. So how can we develop partnerships for becoming and strengthening us with them, with as guardians of creation? So that's the only point that I wanted to make. And delighted for being together. And thank you, Ken, for inviting me to your group. And thank you for sharing, all of you.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Anyone that hasn't had a chance to say anything that wants to get a word in edgewise?
What I did want to share, Ken, was that one of the things that always amazed me was as we were working early on the eco-justice issues under Jitsu Morikawa's direction, it became clear to me that institutional change, that America had pioneered amazing movements for this in terms of forming voluntary associations for institutional change, structural change in America. The women's movement, the anti-slavery movement, those were immensely powerful movement, and they depended on lay people and ministers, and they were most effective when they were deeply inclusive. And when I became involved in stream conservation in a very small area, just trying to save local cold water streams, I began to realize that what I'd learned as a pastor of a church worked very well. I mean, you got to organize, you have to have a message, you have to invite people to make a decision, like evangelists always do. And then they come together and they struggle to form something, and some drop out, and you got to get, you learn that as a minister, you got to do what you ask people to do. You can't tell them and not do it, or nobody gets it, you don't get it. And so we did stream restoration, and we sweated together, and that also sifted the group down. And then you ended with some people, and then a crisis occurred when all of the fish in Valley Creek, the Bell Stream of Chester County, perhaps over the world, which had a large trout population, were killed with a cyanide spill when it was pumped into the water. And at that point, people were ready for change, but we had been working for 2 years with a little committee to save Valley Creek and to deal with a polluting landfill, whose owners were in charge of politics in Chester County and money at that point. And they owned the landfill, and they were taking hazardous and toxic waste. So that point about that was just made about the people who make the decisions, many of them live in America or Canada. Mm-hmm. And how do you get at them? Well, this got at them because people were ready for a change, and things did happen, but it was because we had formed a group and an organization. I think that's one of my learnings, which baffles me as to how we get it back into the church, except that Jesus always taught that being a disciple, you had to do it. It wasn't, you can't just understand it from the outside. It's only as you follow Jesus and do what he tells you to do and make mistakes and learn and try again and keep evaluating and then see, and then you see miracles happening every day, genuine acts of God. But my problem at this point is, how do we take this back to the point that was made about praising the Lord? Because I think we must do that. There's got to be a ground that's deep. And so that's where I am at this point.
Thanks, Owen. We are now 15 minutes past the time we agreed to. Does anyone have a comment about what comes next? What connections can be made next? Whether we need to meet together again? Well, why don't I just made a note on the chat that if you have ideas about where we need to go next, write them to me. I'll disseminate them if that's necessary, or you can send a message to everyone simply by using the email list that you got with all of the notes you received from everybody. Any final comments?
No, except I think it's very valuable that you're pulling folks together at this critical time, because we are moving into a crisis time. So people will take action now in ways that we could never imagine. Probably the best model is 1931, 32, 33, 34. Who would have ever thought that communists would have been organizing in Muncie, Indiana, or in Racine, Wisconsin, but the fascists were out with, and all the different parties were out. Once people see that the economy is never going to come back the way that it was, it will not keep growing, and that there will not be an increasing multiplication of jobs, many of which should have never been done. Okay, that we shouldn't be doing the things that we're doing. And we're going to have to look at them. Like, we shouldn't have built all these roads. We shouldn't have all of these airplanes. We shouldn't have these cruise ships and the mess they make. We should have thought about the problems they create before we ever did them, but we didn't. So now we have to deal with that. And all those folks are going to be out, and you're helping us to get clear on our message and our process, which is listening to each other, and also seeing how we move together. Those are all elemental and necessary, and it will grow.
Thank you for that. I want to just throw in one final comment. I would be very discouraged if nothing happens in the American Baptist churches on the denominational level. I mean, we do have national ministries that plans conferences on social justice. I attended one a couple of years ago. We have a biennial coming up, a virtual biennial. Maybe we'll get back to Puerto Rico. What's going to be the agenda of those gatherings? Is anybody going to be pressing the denominational structure to put these life for everybody issues on the table, so that it is acknowledged to be the core issue facing humanity? And what kind of Christianity are we going forward with, and into the unknown future? I don't feel like, as I'm not in any of the structures anymore, I don't feel like that's my call, but I certainly want to be helpful and supportive of anything like that happens. And I just think it's critical that
I have one thought on this. Tomorrow, the Creation Justice Network having a virtual steering meeting, right, Rebecca? Yeah, so we're meeting tomorrow, a retreat, a virtual retreat, I think is what we're calling it. I think, Rebecca, this should be on our agenda. And instead of trying to do and think about our next steps in a rushed manner, we have set time for our direction planning tomorrow.
Good.
So why don't we put this on our agenda for tomorrow, if that's okay, Rebecca?
Have you seen the agenda? It's already there. And
Haven't
I
seen it
also
yet.
was in the leadership team meeting for the Office of the General Secretary, and they do not yet have a schedule for the virtual biennial. But I have asked them for
Great.
updates on where we might fit in. And I've had some conversations about how the creation
Yeah,
justice
so
network might
I haven't seen the
manifest
agenda
itself,
yet.
in the biennial. So hopefully,
If you
that
need
will be able
support
to-
for that effort, let us know.
yeah, definitely.
Grassroots,
I
you
will
know,
do.
coming up from the bottom, maybe.
So Rebecca, I haven't seen the agenda. Did you send it out to us
I
by
did. I
email?
sent it out
Or-
yesterday. I can resend it to you, but it was sent out yesterday.
Yeah, I didn't get it. So I must have got off the list.
Okay.
Sorry, one quick sentence. Rebecca, I would say at the denominational level, it feels kind of, as we said earlier, or it was in the comments earlier, like we're kind of green teaming if we're just trying to find a space to talk about climate. And so, or creation care, or whatever, terms we want to use. That's not to say we shouldn't have a space carved out, but I really think we need to still have a conversation about how is it just a part of the overall theology? How is it a lens that's put to all aspects from, where it's not in person. I was going to say from what we eat, but that doesn't matter because we're not there in person. But just still, like, how is it a part of the music or selection? Like, if there is ministering worship, just how is it incorporated into all things? Part of the work that as it gets shaped.
Yeah, 100%, Karen.
I would love to see Chet.
That's
I would love to
absolutely
see
right.
Chet Myers on the agenda as a major presenter. Betsy knows all about him.
I didn't hear the first part of your sentence.
Oh, I just said I would love to see someone like Chet Myers on the agenda for a major presentation on the Bible study that undergirds this effort. He's fantastic. And if you want to know how fantastic, watch some of the material Betsy just sent out.
So I am a fan of Chet Myers, but I just want to reemphasize what Karen just said. It's not a question of doing this or doing that from a green perspective. What we need to move toward is framing our entire life together.
Amen.
From a theocentric, all creation point of view. So every song we sing, every prayer we give, every activity we plan, every liturgy in which we share, every meal we eat, every workshop about anything needs to be rethought and reframed from this perspective.
Amen.
Yes.
Well said. Okay. Write me a note if you have ideas about what needs to come next. I think there's many things that are already spinning out there that are going to start happening simply because we met. God bless everyone and have good evenings. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.